Okay, all right. Well, thank you everybody for coming. It's great to see you all here. So Iyad Ghanim, I'm in the School of Communication Disorders and Deafness. My research is about the psycholinguistics of bilingualism, speech perception, and language comprehension. This project is a COVID-born project. It's discussing the impact of mask wearing on bilingual speech comprehension. It was born out of a need for kind of the special treatment that we often give to bilinguals and their speech comprehension in light of the speech comprehension and the way that the psycholinguistics of bilingualism functions. Too little research is done on bilinguals who are English dominant and are not as dominant in their other language, but it turns out they do also reflect some differences and similarities that we need to kind of appreciate when having conversations with bilinguals. So some of the extra, just overall, listening to a conversation is more difficult when you don't have as many phonetic cues, as many acoustic cues that you need to perceive the speech if it's delivered vocally to you. So if there's conditions of background noise, if the listener is hearing impaired, if there's a conversation going on in the background, it's going to be more difficult to understand that conversation, which makes sense. This is all kind of typical expectancy. Most listeners can recover from an impoverished acoustic signal when you give them some more information. So if they're given logic, if they can draw inferences, they can use their previous knowledge, their memory. I always say whenever you speak on the phone to somebody like your sibling or somebody that you're very close with, even if you have a really bad signal, you should be able to communicate with them pretty well. You should be able to pick up the pieces and fill in the gaps. But if it's somebody that you haven't spoken to before, it's going to be a lot more difficult to try and make that conversation happen. And that's because you're using your previous knowledge, your contextual information, what the person sounds and talks like to fill in those gaps. So most listeners can do this, and they do this quite well. Our problem is that bilinguals don't do this quite as well. Bilinguals are less able to use those other sources to fill in those gaps. And this is not just referring to bilinguals who are weaker in the language that you're using, but even if they're very dominant in that language, the fact that there are two languages kind of swirling about makes it more difficult for them to use that extra information that exists. So we know that acoustic cues are important. When the speaker's wearing a mask, we have some extra effects of this impoverished acoustic signal. Of course, the mask is not only kind of covering up some of the visual cues that you're seeing. You're not able to see their lips move. You can't see kind of their placement of their jaw, and that kind of helps you perceive speech. But in addition to that, you have the mask obscuring some of the acoustic cues as well. So you have a decreased volume and potentially some other frequency effects from the mask. A lot of research, especially very recently, has come out about mask wearing. It's kind of been mixed and depends on the quality of the mask that you're using. For the most part, some people say that there's a minimal effect on word recognition. Others suggest that it might have an impact for children, but not so much for adults. It has kind of a lesser impact. When we start to look at the data that is talking about more complex tasks, when you're starting to ask a person to do some semantic processing, something quite difficult, then you start to see the impact of masking kind of come into play a little bit more. So the idea is when things are really complex, when the speaker has to rely on some cognition, some extra processing power, that's when we start to see an impact of masking. So in combination here, we show conversation generally works like this. We have top-down sources, your logic, your background, your inferencing, and some bottom-up sources of the acoustic and visual information. And again, this is not the same effect for bilinguals. So what I'm focusing on is investigating how bilinguals navigate the use of semantic information, how they can use meaning-related information to try and recover from the impact of mask wearing. So if bilinguals are slower and less able to use context for comprehension, then they should be kind of worse off in masks. My question was, if you give them more semantic information, can they use it as effectively as monolinguals do, or are they still kind of up creek without a paddle and still trying to figure out that conversation in other ways? So to do this, I had 12 monolingual participants and 18 bilinguals. The bilinguals acquired English between 0 and 5 years of age. They were Spanish and English bilinguals, but they were dominant in English language. So they either found Spanish to be their non-dominant language, or a language that they had kind of forgotten a little bit because they used it at home and didn't really use it too much. In any case, the bilinguals were mostly English dominant. I gave them a list of pairs of words, 2 at a time, and the words were either highly related, like coffee and mug. That relationship is really strong. They kind of mean they go together pretty nicely. They could be weakly related, like coffee and cream. They do go well together, but not as strongly as coffee and mug. You really build that connection is far stronger there. And finally, they might be unrelated, like coffee and rain. As much as that sounds nice and is pleasant, it's probably not the first thing you think of when you have coffee in that word pair. So the idea is if you deliver that first word, the processing of the second word should be a little bit easier. They should have been primed for that second word if the first word is highly related. If they were not primed and delivering coffee does not facilitate the processing of a word like mug, then they're not using that semantic information as strongly. And that's the mechanics behind this paradigm that I operated with. So this is one of our students. Actually, I had him record the pairs of words either masked or not masked. And then we delivered them in pairs to our participants. So, excuse me. So what I had found was all of this, basically. So our bilinguals are shown on the left, our monolinguals are on the right. Looking at the monolinguals first, we see that the difference between masked and not masked condition was very minimal. There was basically no difference between them. This is in line with what the previous research is telling us about, first of all, mask wearing, that it probably doesn't affect conversation as much as we want it to, or think it does. The other thing it tells us is that monolinguals can recover when you deliver extra semantic information. So when the words are strongly correlated with each other, really tightly connected, you don't see a difference between mask wearing. When the words are unrelated, it might take them longer to process, but they're still able to make that connection process pretty efficiently. With bilinguals, on the other hand, we see this kind of gap that shows up, especially in the unrelated pairs of words. So whereas monolingual processing speed is not really affected, in bilinguals we see that there is some reliance on some bottom-up information. So what we're looking at here is that the unrelated pairs of words that have no semantic relationship, the not masked conditions were fast, the processing speed was efficient, but the masked pairs took far longer to process. So when there's no semantic relationship, the mask wearing gets in the way, and they're not really able to recover as much as we expect them to. So because processing was faster than expected for not mask related pairs, there's a little reliance on semantic information. So this is reaffirming our previous findings of bilinguals relying on bottom-up information. They really like to cling to that acoustic information and not really strongly using the semantic cues to make sense of an utterance that they hear. A lot of theories connect this to cross-linguistic competition. The fact that there are 2 languages in the person's brain makes it complex and more difficult to process. Excuse me. We also know that recruiting semantic information requires more cognitive strain, and that for bilinguals, because of the dual languages that are going on, it is something that bilinguals struggle with more frequently. So in the future, I'm hoping to investigate the roles of the age of acquisition. So if you acquired your language in childhood versus if you acquired your language as an adult, if that was a bigger difference. And also comparing the task effects, if the task was more complex or easier. So that's that. Thank you.
Can you do that all again wearing a mask?
I don't think so. Questions? Yes.
Question. Does the gender of the person presenting the stimuli impact any of this?
That's a good question. Probably, because the mask is obviously impeding some of the frequencies that come in, some of the acoustic frequencies. There would be an effect. Most of the research uses male voices, and so I just kind of went in line with that. It would have been nice to do both just to check the differences, but yeah, so it probably would happen.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, as somebody who relates, because I'm primarily English speaking, but I'm bilingual, just wondering why your starting point of participants was with that group versus people that maybe a second language was their primary and English was their secondary. Just the evidence kind of led you, or this was just a starting point?
That English was their.
So, for the participants here, English was their primary language,
Correct.
though
Yes.
they were bilingual. Why not sort of a group in the reverse?
Yeah, a lot of, that's a good question. A lot of the research that exists investigates second language English users. So the opposite would be to use participants whose primary language is Spanish and they learn English and they're not dominant in English. What that boils down to whenever we get those results is that bilingual, it's due to the fact that the language is acquired late or is not as dominant. And while we expect that to be true, I'm less interested in the effects of a language that you don't know super well. I'm interested in what happens to a language that you do know really well, that is your dominant language, that you prefer to use, because we still see differences there.
With the mass mark, you're saying?
Correct, yeah. A lot of people expect that if it's your first language or your dominant language, you're good to go, but there are still differences that we find, and that's kind of the realm that I operate in.
Is there evidence that has investigated English not as the primary language and mask wearing?
No, the literature on mask wearing in general is very, very small. But this just kind of fits in with the previous research that I've been doing, but obviously the next step would be to expand this with more bilinguals to investigate the effects of the dominant versus non-dominant language. That's certainly an effect.
Thank you.
That was a great question.
Given the time lag, as having students in classes that we were teaching whilst wearing masks, do you think that could be a reason? Is the time lag big enough for them to be missing information and therefore not able to catch up and recover as they go forward?
Which time lag are you referring to?
You say that it takes them longer to recover. So does that mean that it's taking them longer to process within the classroom and therefore they might end up not catching up?
Yeah, that's a good point. The time lag we're referring to is very small, probably on the order of 50 to 80 milliseconds. A really short time lag. I think the more important piece is that delay is coming from the fact that their cognition is not able to keep up with it.
Yeah.
Not because obviously they're cognitively different than peers, but because they're doing so many different tasks that other people don't have to do, that it actually is slowing down their processing. And that's really kind of the finding here, that because you have two languages, you have to suppress one of the languages and do all this extra work. So in terms of our students and the impact of that, when we're talking to bilingual students, there's so much more going on that possibly could delay their ability to comprehend what we're saying.
So do we need to adjust our rates more?
Yeah, one way to do this would be I think the rate would help. If you slow down your rate, you increase the acoustic quality. If you speak louder, you increase that acoustic quality for bilinguals as well. Gestures help. Seeing your lips, so if you can use a mask that is clear, that would be helpful to bilinguals. Giving them extra context, though, and examples probably will not help. But yes, I definitely think that adjusting the rate and adjusting the way that you're speaking would be impactful in helping to limit those effects.
Is there any research, and I'm sorry to say this at the beginning, any research related to the visual attention of bilingual speakers? Or do bilingual speakers visually attentive now or not? Others, is that with, right, the visual, and there's, what happens to reading, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we do use the visual cues to help us process speech. Monolinguals and bilinguals both use that. A lot of people think that the visual cues are helpful, but in effect, what the research is finding is that the acoustic cues and the visual cues come together. And so if they're out of sync, your brain doesn't pick one, your brain will actually merge the two of them and create a sound that you did not hear or see altogether. So that's weird. Bilinguals don't attend, as far as I know in the research that I'm familiar with, bilinguals don't attend to the mouth more frequently than other users. I think it's just pragmatically in conversation, we just kind of do this natural looking to the mouth. I don't think bilinguals do it more frequently. That's a good question. That would kind of lead us to think that maybe they're using more of those visual cues.
Thank you.
Dr. Ghanim, would
Yes.
you repeat what you just said, in Laga's one? What did you just say again? I want you to process it again.
Sure.
One more time.
The visual and audio.
I think so.
Yeah, so we kind of in conversation merge the two
Yeah,
effect,
that.
the audio and the visual information. When they're out of sync, so if you're looking at a mouth that is making the ba ba sound, for example, but what you're hearing is ga ga, for example. When they're out of sync and they're in conflict with each other, your brain will merge the two and create a sound that it did not see or hear. So your brain will decide it has heard da da, when that was not in any of the input.
Which would help when you're associating words like cup and rain.
Right.
What did you create, right? It wasn't raining.
Correct, yeah. Phonemically, on the level of the speech sound, we have this effect, it's called the McGurk effect, where the two pieces are kind of combined and creates this new thing that doesn't exist. So it's a perceptual illusion. So it's telling us the importance of the visual cues in processing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm actually just more interested in just in terms of your recruitment and so forth. And who,
Yeah.
like, what was your sample size and so forth? Because that
Sure.
I think to me is like the basis of you moving forward, in terms of like future research.
Yeah, the recruitment, I had 18 bilinguals here. The trouble with bilingual recruiting is that with all recruiting in general, but more specifically with research that deals with bilinguals, is that we're trying to get a really narrow sample of very specific groups of people. So they have to have a certain range of age of acquisition. They need to be of certain proficiency levels. So that was part of the challenges that I had. But they're all Kean students who volunteered out of their goodness.
Or were there any more, besides what's listed there, were there any more inclusionary or exclusionary criteria, especially as you just said they have to meet certain requirements?
Yeah, so the inclusionary criteria were that they had to have a certain age of acquisition, so they acquired between 0 and 5 years old. I also did include people who were beyond that, but they were not included for analysis. That was just data we collected for the hopes of using it eventually. They had to also be between 18 and 34 years of age. That's the time frame that we don't expect there to be any hearing or language differences.
And I think the fourth bullet point, like Spanish and English, was that just how it sort of came about, or you were intentional in
Yes.
other languages?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we were intentional in choosing Spanish-English combination. That mostly it's just a convenience samples. We find a lot of those students of that type, so that's what we decided to go with. And the reason for so a lot of the research that I do, I don't restrain the first language at all, so you could be any type of bilingual, because I don't think it should matter in your English processing. There should be possibly an effect of semantics that are different in English based on the language you used to speak, but it is a very negligible effect. In terms of publishing and distributing your work, a lot of people like to see that you have focused your bilinguals very tightly, because bilinguals range so much that it's useful if you can limit them as much as is possible. And so that was the reason for that choice. But would it make a difference if I chose Polish English bilinguals? Probably not.
Okay, that was my question.
That's a good question. Great. Well, thank you, everybody. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
you.